Right, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's fantastic to be here and such an honour to have been asked to deliver the St John Lecture for 2021. I'd like to begin by thanking the conveners of the Beverley Sanctuary Project for inviting me to do so, and for their support over the last few years. I first heard about the project when I read a short piece in the Yorkshire Post way back in 2019, when the world was a very different place than it is now. I made contact with some of the project conveners expressing my interest in being involved in any way possible, and everybody I've spoken to thereafter couldn't have been more encouraging and welcoming, for which I'm hugely grateful. I'm particularly thankful to Barbara, Roger, and Mervyn in this regard. It's given me a chance to be part of an extraordinary project and indulge my passion for the history of sanctuary. And what better way to indulge this passion than by exploring the rich history of Beverley as a place of sanctuary? As one of the preeminent sanctuaries in medieval and early Tudor England, the protection the sanctuary of St John afforded all manner of criminals, from dastardly individuals to deserving victims, abounds in surviving source material from this period. And as we can see, the Beverley Sanctuary Project has done an exemplary job of illuminating this. As a result of the efforts of all those involved, in which my contribution, I should add, has been negligible, we have a greater understanding than ever before of those who sought refuge here and the lives that they led. So one of my aims today is to add to this rich picture through an exploration of some of the original research I've conducted in the course of my PhD over the last 4 years. My research examined the history of sanctuary seeking in England from the turn of the 15th century to the accession of the Stuarts, with a particular focus on the changes wrought to the privilege by the Tudors. Now, by drawing on some of my archival findings, I hope to demonstrate two things to you today. First, I will show you just how significant the sanctuary of St John of Beverley was as a place of refuge. I'll do this by considering Beverley's position within the wider context of locations at which sanctuary for perpetuity could be sought before 1540. 1540 being the year in which all sanctuary rights, like those operating at Beverley, were swept away by Act of Parliament. As a result, Beverley's position as one of the most celebrated and important locations at which sanctuary could be sought in medieval and early Tudor England is unmistakable. I will then try and give a sense of the lives of some of those who sought sanctuary there following their admission, through the examination of a corpus of original archival material. This will help us understand why it was that the privilege of St John proved to be such a draw for all manner of malefactors from all corners of England. But before we proceed any further, I thought it might be nice to show you a video made by the Beverley Picture Playhouse in 1937. I have the archivist at the East Riding Record Office to thank for bringing this to my attention. Personally, I think it's an absolute masterpiece, and I'm sure a lot of you will agree. I think it's quite scandalous that it's had so few views, so I think it's time we all worked hard to make sure that it goes viral. So here we go.
Back for a moment or two and have a look at this picture of sanctuary. Here is a fugitive making his way to the sanctuary store. Exhausted and panting for breath, he reaches at last the church door. He hammers on the door for admittance. Knowing that once inside the church he is safe. At last the door is open and the priest gives him his hand. And he makes his way to the fifth stool. Now he has reached sanctuary, and no one dare strike him.
Fantastic. Hopefully that came across okay, and you can actually hear some of the audio. So this production provides a great introduction to the history and practice of sanctuary seeking, not just at Beverley, but also something of its dynamics more generally. But for the purposes of this presentation, it's probably necessary to add a few more details about the types of sanctuary available and the manner in which these were sought in England. So, by the turn of the 15th century, the common law recognised two types of sanctuary, common and private, sometimes referred to as general and chartered respectively. Common sanctuary referred to the customary right of every church and churchyard to shelter those who had committed a capital offence for a maximum of 40 days. This was a right understood under the first chapter of Magna Carta, guaranteeing the rights and liberties of the English Church. Now, the types of offences that were capital in this period were broad, ranging from high treason all the way down to theft of goods worth 12 pence. Sanctuary helped mitigate the severity of this bloody penal code. Sometime within these 40 days, the felon was required to call for a coroner to attend upon him. The duty of the coroner in this instance was to formally administer a custom unique to England, known as abjuration of the realm, which was tantamount to exile. But by abjuring, the felon's life was spared, for if he remained in a common sanctuary beyond the customary 40 days, attempts would be made to coerce him out. Contemporaries were somewhat divided as to whether he could be seized, and he'd be tried for his crimes or crime before the royal courts. In order to abjure, the felon had to confess his crime before the coroner. After doing so, he had to assume the penitential guise of a white sackcloth supplied by this officer. From this point on, the felon was considered dead in law, and all his goods were forfeit to the crown. The only protection afforded to him was the immunity of the King's Highway, along which he would travel to a port, usually nominated by the coroner, whilst clutching a wooden cross supplied by this officer. Upon reaching his designated port, the adjurer was to embark on the first ship that would consent to grant him passage to a foreign but only Christian land. He could only return to England if he obtained a royal pardon. If he did so without licence, he could be summarily slain wherever he were found. However, under Henry VIII, this centuries-old custom of abjuring the realm was abolished, and from 1531 onwards, felons were statutorily required to abjure to England's second type of sanctuary, the private sanctuary. So before this date, all those who sought refuge at private sanctuaries had made their own way there. Now, private sanctuaries were ecclesiastical liberties established by royal and papal grants and charters, which conferred upon them greater privileges than those that attached to common sanctuaries. Beverley was one such private sanctuary. Now, the details of these grants of which Beverley was in possession of have been richly explored in this exhibit, so need not be recounted here. All we need to remain aware of is that by virtue of these grants and customs, the Sanctuary of St. John was permitted to shelter felons guilty of all manner of offences for perpetuity within its liberty. And as we know, the extent of this privileged area was broad, encompassing the whole town of Beverley and its environs. When this privileged area was first defined in the 12th century, it was said to have extended a mile from the church door, but histories of Beverley have shown that the limit seems to have been closer to a mile from the edge of the town itself, a perimeter that was roughly demarcated by the famous sanctuary crosses. So we know that Beverley was important in the sense that it was part of this second group, the private sanctuary, where both felons and those guilty of civil offences such as debt could successfully claim refuge for life. Furthermore, even when one is equipped with a basic knowledge of sanctuary, the national reputation of the privilege of St. John is unmistakable in virtually all material on the subject. So Beverley was important, yes, but just how significant was it? Because the truth is that until now, there has existed no single comprehensive list of England's private sanctuaries before they were all dissolved in 1540. Several early scholars on the subject made some attempt to do so, but with varying levels of diligence and success. Thus, estimates of the number of private sanctuaries that existed in England vary from approximately 20 to 30. Now, this isn't really very helpful to us, because it's only when we have a sense of the number of locations at which sanctuary could be sought that we can try and gauge Beverley's importance. Now, throughout the course of my PhD, I've compiled a list of all the locations at which private sanctuaries existed in England. That is, to reiterate, those locations, as at Beverley, that were endowed with greater sanctuary privileges than the 40-day right attached to every church and churchyard. I've done so by drawing on a range of archival and printed primary material, along with a corpus of authoritative secondary literature. And this is the result. So according to my research, there are at least 67 locations throughout England at which sanctuary could be sought for perpetuity, of which Beverley was one. Considerably more than the 20 to 30 such locations that sanctuary scholarship has traditionally thought existed. Even more interestingly, the findings presented here may just be the tip of the iceberg. I've only plotted the locations on this map for which explicit evidence survives that the right to protect felons for perpetuity was either claimed or we can see operating. But there were three religious orders in England, the Carthusians, the Gilbertines, and the Knights Hospitaller of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, that made explicit claims at all their religious houses, and, in the case of the Order of St. John, all their secular properties too, enjoyed identical sanctuary privileges to protect all manner of felons for term of life. Importantly, these were claims that were recognised before the royal courts. However, as stated, only those properties for which there exists clear evidence that private sanctuary rights were known to have been operative have been plotted on this map. As such, a further 54 properties belonging to the Order of St. John, 20 for the Gilbertines and 7 for the Carthusians have not been recorded here. But these were properties which theoretically shared the same privileges as their respective orders as a whole. Thus, the true number of private sanctuaries in England could have been considerably greater than scholarship has traditionally recognised. And there were very likely more. Source material is, of course, never as plentiful as a historian would like, so there will be some private sanctuaries we'll never know existed, let alone be able to understand something of their operation and administration. But of course, we are fortunate in that for the Sanctuary of St. John, we have one of the most valuable sources, if not the most valuable source, for understanding sanctuary in medieval and early Tudor England. The Beverley Sanctuary Register provides an unparalleled insight into the dynamics of sanctuary seeking, how it was claimed at Beverley, the types of people claiming it, for what crimes, their origins, and so much more. It's central to our understanding of sanctuary seeking for the period that it covers. Now, in order to gauge something of Beverley's significance in a somewhat crowded market of sanctuaries, if you will, I've plotted on a map the origins of all those who sought sanctuary at St. John for the entire period covered by the register. When viewed alongside the map recording the other locations at which sanctuary could be sought for term of life, the contents of the Beverley Sanctuary Register are particularly illuminating. So here we are. So plotting them on top of each other was unfortunately a sort of visual overload, so they'll have to be considered alongside one another. But by comparing them in this manner, I don't think the impact is lost. So it's just quickly necessary to note that the map on the right doesn't record the origins of all those names recorded in the Sanctuary Register. Since my PhD was concerned with sanctuary in England, 2 felons from Wales have not been included because this map was originally in my PhD thesis. In addition, the origins of 29 sanctuary seekers were never recorded in the Surtees edition of the Beverley Sanctuary Register, either because they were never entered in the first place or because the manuscript has suffered damage to the extent that they are illegible. The locations from which a further 7 sanctuary seekers originated are legible, but I've unfortunately been unable to locate them. Nevertheless, the vast majority of individuals who were admitted to the Sanctuary of St. John are plotted here, and a series of questions are immediately generated when these maps are viewed alongside one another. Perhaps the principal of these questions being, what motivated many of those whose names are recorded in the Sanctuary Register to travel such extensive distances in order to seek admission to the Sanctuary of St. John at Beverley and not somewhere else? After all, while the willingness of individuals to travel extensive distances to seek sanctuary at Beverley has long been known, until now it's not been known just how many other private sanctuaries they were bypassing in order to do so, several of which enjoyed similar fame throughout England. Indeed, many of those recorded in the Sanctuary Register had actually come from the exact locations at which a private sanctuary was located or was very close by, sanctuaries many individuals who travelled to Beverley were undoubtedly aware of. So to take an example from the register, the furthest recorded journey was undertaken by John Torr, a yeoman from Newton Abbot in Devon, just over 300 miles away. He claimed sanctuary on 26th of August 1531 for a felony committed on London Bridge and for other causes. So should Torr have taken a relatively direct route to Beverley from Newton Abbot, he'd have come within a short distance of at least 11 private sanctuaries that would have sheltered him for his crimes. And, like I say, many of these would have undoubtedly been known to him. Newnham Abbey was a private sanctuary Torr may have been familiar with. It was a grand Cistercian abbey of huge wealth and influence, and was located just 40-odd miles from Newton Abbot. Slightly further afield was one of the most famous sanctuaries in England, that of Beaulieu Abbey, just over 100 miles from Newton Abbot, or a third of the distance Torr travelled to reach Beverley. Now, Tor may be an extreme example, but from this map on the right, we can see that the distances travelled by a large proportion of those who sought refuge at Beverley could have been considerably shorter if they'd merely been seeking perpetual sanctuary. From this, we can surely assume that Beverley enjoyed an appeal as a place of refuge few locations in England could match, let alone surpass. Of course, without comparable source material to the Beverley Sanctuary Register for most of England's other preeminent private sanctuaries, we have no way of knowing whether a similar pull could have been witnessed to these other locations as well. Might we witness Westminster Abbey drawing felons from many of the northern counties, for example, should evidence of the origins of all those who sought sanctuary there survive? Other prominent private sanctuaries, such as that of St John at Colchester, St Peter's at York, and St Martin le Grand in London, also had national reputations, and so it's possible similar trends could be detected there too if we had the evidence. Certainly for one such celebrated private sanctuary, we do possess a similar source to the Beverley Sanctuary Register, this being the names of those who sought refuge at the Sanctuary St Cuthbert at Durham, as recorded in the cathedral registers. Even just a cursory glance at the origins of many of those who were admitted to that sanctuary reveals that Beverley was not always the preferred choice, but sometimes felt itself overlooked by felons willing to travel further north. But the point is that those who sought sanctuary at Beverley did so for a particular reason. Few, we can assume, did so for lack of alternatives, of which we know there were many. Indeed, what is remarkable when studying sanctuary is the unmistakable sense of agency displayed by those who sought it. Now, this is shown, as I say, like on this map on the right, but let's also look at a specific example. So when the somewhat ironically named John Goodman abjured from the parish church of Barrington in Cambridgeshire for horse theft on 9th of February 1534, he chose to abjure to Beverley, about 136 miles away, rather than someplace else. Based on the quantitative data compiled by the editor of the 30s edition of the Sanctuary Register, Goodman was pretty representative of most of those who sought refuge at Beverley, most notably in that he was male, a yeoman, and was guilty of theft. But Goodman's case is even more interesting, because he had not sought sanctuary at Barrington Parish Church alone, but he had done so with an accomplice, one Walter Haight. They had both confessed their crime before the attendant coroner at the same time. And yet while Goodman chose to abjure to Beverley, Haight abjured to the sanctuary of St John at Colchester, a much shorter walk of 50-odd miles. By historians' calculations, an average person in this period could feasibly expect to cover somewhere in the region of about 15 to 20 miles per day. So while Haight chose about a 3-day walk, Goodman committed to undertaking a journey of at least a week, if not more. Interestingly, Goodman isn't recorded in the Sanctuary Register. Was this just a simple oversight at the time of his admission, or did he make a hasty exit from the highway en route? We'll perhaps never know, but it'd be surprising if it was the latter. 5 years earlier, in 1529, an act had been passed that required all those who abjured to be branded on the brawn of their right thumb with the letter A to ensure that everybody knew they'd done so. And the coroner's inquest drawn up at the time of Goodman's abjuration from Barrington Parish Church noted that this duty had been carried out. So why were felons like Goodman travelling to Beverley and not another location? After all, we can be certain that no felon or coroner was familiar with all the private sanctuaries identified earlier. They would have likely been familiar with several of them at least. And yet Goodman didn't choose to abjure to the same location as his accomplice, Walter Haight, nor did he choose to abjure to one of the many other celebrated private sanctuaries to which either he or the attendant coroner were no doubt aware of, such as those at Ely, approximately 20 miles away, Bury St Edmunds, 35 miles away, or even Westminster, about 50 miles away. We'll never know for certain what it was that rendered Beverley so attractive to the mixture of deserving and undeserving offenders who sought sanctuary there. Many must have just been eager to get away from the scene of their crime, whether to avoid the vengeance of their victim's kinsmen, or just because they wanted to try and make a fresh start. Obviously, some very practical considerations likely also played a part. Road networks, for example. Beverley was undoubtedly easier to reach for most than was the parish church of St Buryan in Cornwall, for instance, which is one of the other private sanctuaries I've identified. Some of Beverley's appeal may have been spiritual. While the cult of St John was perhaps not as strong in the period covered by the Sanctuary Register as it previously had been, the power of this saint's relics and the protection they afforded would have undoubtedly been instrumental in why some felons chose to seek refuge at Beverley rather than at another private sanctuary. But undoubtedly the most important part of Beverley's appeal was its extensive sanctuary precinct, within which those who sought refuge could live and work. Few other private sanctuaries in England covered such extensive areas. Most, such as that of St Cuthbert at Durham, were often confined to the precinct of the religious house itself. Some private sanctuaries did cover areas of a similar extent to Beverley, at Ripon, Southwell and Hexham, to name but a few. But Beverley was also a bustling town, a regional trading centre with a developed textile and leather industry, along with regular markets that brought traders and consumers from far and wide. And as a result, there were opportunities for sanctuary men and women at Beverley that were not available at many other locations. For many would have practiced their trade or craft within this liberty. This would have allowed felons to support themselves while trying to secure a royal pardon, or if a debtor, to work towards satisfying their creditors. And for those without a trade, there was likely better chance of securing employment in the service of others in a busy regional town like Beverley than there was in an isolated sanctuary elsewhere. In short, there are a range of reasons that individuals might seek refuge in the liberty of St John at Beverley and bypass many of England's other private sanctuaries in order to do so. Some economic, others spiritual, many practical. So now we have a better understanding of the significance of the sanctuary of St John in a national context and a sense of why many individuals chose to find refuge there. But what about their lives following their admission? The current exhibit has done a wonderful job of teasing out some of the individual stories of those whose names feature in the Sanctuary Register, and I'd like to contribute some further examples I found in the archives throughout the course of my PhD research. These examples will help us understand why Beverley proved to be such a draw for individuals seeking sanctuary for their offences, and also something of their lives there following their admission. I'd like to begin by looking at a particularly insightful episode that enters the historical record at the turn of the 16th century. It's worth exploring in detail because it included individuals from a cross-section of society in Beverley: church, town government, and Beverley's privileged and non-privileged inhabitants. As a result, we're able to get a sense of how these groups intersected and what factors occasionally led to the explosive episode I will now relate. So sometime between 1504 and 1505, the record can't be dated any more precisely unfortunately, the Provost of Beverley, Thomas Dolby, petitioned the Court of Requests in London, seeking the aid of the King. In this petition, Dolby complained that on the 1st of August 1504, his bailiff, one Griffith Ewan, was going about his business in God's peace and was intending no hurt to any creature, when he was attacked by Richard Brewer, William Salmon, John Blaithwaite, Thomas Gartham, and several unnamed others associated with them. According to Dolby's account, Ewan was beaten to within an inch of his life, suffering 15 serious bloody wounds, after which the perpetrators had left him for dead. Their motives for doing so are unfortunately never mentioned in Dolby's account. However, Dolby claimed that he required the King's aid because he had been unable to bring Ewan's attackers to justice by way of local law enforcement, lamenting that there are 12 persons who pretend to be the governors of the said town that in no wise will suffer any of their burgesses for any fray or like offence to be arrested nor put in prison. And this was a reference to the 12 keepers of the town who were chosen annually by the burgesses. It appears from this statement in Dolby's account that several of those involved were actually burgesses themselves, although he doesn't identify which ones. Rowland Stockwell, the under-bailiff to the Archbishop of York, along with John Tomlinson, the Provost's other bailiff, had commanded that 4 of the 12, Thomas Pearson, Richard Laxton, Robert Booth, and James Taylor, imprison Ewan's attackers or stand surety for their good behaviour thereafter. But despite the fact that the Archbishop of York was one of the dominant figures in Beverley throughout the period under review here, this intervention had little effect, for Pearson, Laxton, Booth and Taylor refused to do so. As a result, Ewan's attackers had continued their campaign of harassment against him, a campaign that had sometime after Ewan's assault been spearheaded by one Stephen Gates, who is mentioned as being involved for the first time. The Provost complained that these 5, Pearson, Laxton, Booth, Taylor and Gates, were treating Beverley like their own personal fiefdom. As such, Dolby complained that the collegiate church could not be properly maintained, since his sub-ministers could not go about their necessary business. However, 3 of the accused, Laxton, Booth and Gates, challenged the Provost's account shortly thereafter by submitting an answer to these charges for the consideration of the Master of the Court of Requests. Their answer paints a very different picture to the Provost's, whose petition they claimed was grounded of malice. The Provost's bailiff and the victim of the assault in question, Griffith Ewan, was, they claimed, a simple person and a man of evil disposition, who had been a sanctuary man for over 20 years for felony and murder. Dolby's account had not mentioned that his bailiff was a sanctuary man. This is the first we hear of it. Unfortunately, Ewan isn't recorded on the sanctuary register, perhaps because his admission of over 20 years previous just preceded the commencement of the surviving part of the register, beginning in 1478. But Ewan wasn't the only sanctuaryman Laxton, Booth and Gates singled out in their answer. They also claimed that William Salmon was the ringleader in the assault, himself a privileged person. As was the case with Ewan, the fact that Salmon was a sanctuaryman was not mentioned in Dalby's account, and unfortunately Salmon also isn't mentioned on the register. Laxton, Booth and Gates claim that Salmon was the one responsible for assembling other simple persons, as they referred to them as, to attack Ewan. Thus, the three defendants claimed they'd been unfairly implicated. The assault had been carried out by one sanctuaryman, along with his adherents, against another. In framing the incident as such, the defendants suggested that it was little more than a dispute among supposedly warring and troublesome members of Beverley's sanctuary community. Now, if we're to believe this account, then Salmon was in trouble, for he had ostensibly broken some of the clauses contained within the Beverley sanctuary oath he ostensibly swore at the time of his admission. He presumably swore at the time of his admission, even if his name is not recorded in the register. Here are three clauses relevant to the version of the incident presented by Laxton, Booth and Gates. So, one of them being, "Ye shall be true and faithful to my Lord Archbishop of York, Lord of this town, to the provost of the same, to the canons of this church, and all other ministers thereof. Also ye shall hear good heart to the bailiff and 12 governors of the town, to all burgesses and commoners of the same. And finally, also ye shall bear no pointed weapon, dagger, knife, nor no other weapon against the king's peace." Oh dear. So unfortunately the outcome of this particular episode is not known, so we can only speculate on what the ramifications were for those involved. But even if we're not in possession of the full picture, this incident provides a remarkable insight into some of the dynamics of life in the Beverley Sanctuary. Much of this information can be gleaned from reading the aforementioned petitions against the grain rather than focusing on their sensational elements. Now, perhaps one of the most remarkable insights is that Ewan had been a sanctuaryman for over 20 years and had found employment with the provost. Whether he'd been employed by Dalby's predecessors is unclear, but this wasn't unheard of. I've come across examples of sanctuary seekers at Westminster Abbey being employed by the Archdeacon there. But it's notable that even sanctuarymen with questionable backgrounds like Ewan, he was guilty of felony and murder, are found holding positions of some importance. Being bailiff to the provost was hardly a menial task. But this is not to say that all opportunities were open to Beverley's sanctuary seekers. By 1536, a clause declaring that burgesses could not be privileged persons had been incorporated into the oath administered to new burgesses. There is also some evidence that attempts were made to limit the involvement of sanctuary seekers in the local guilds around the turn of the 16th century. Indeed, when we think about the language used to describe Ewan and Salmon, the two sanctuarymen involved, in the answer of Laxton, Booth and Gates, we can see that while those admitted to the liberty of St. John were broadly assimilated into town life, Ewan was being employed, for example, there were perhaps limitations as to how comprehensive this assimilation was. Both Ewan and Salmon are referred to as simple people, and their characters questioned on the basis that they were sanctuarymen. Now, this isn't to say that this is an accurate characterization. Indeed, while we cannot possibly judge the veracity of either of these two accounts explored above, the fact that the Archbishop of York had interceded on the provost's behalf does suggest that we should probably add more weight to Dalby's version of events. But this raises its own questions. Did Laxton, Booth and Gates place the blame squarely on Ewan and Salmon because they saw them as easy targets? Individuals whose past offences and whose status as sanctuarymen made them vulnerable to being viewed with suspicion and tarnished with accusations of guilt and wrongdoing? After all, as has been mentioned, neither Ewan or Salmon were identified as sanctuarymen in the provost's petition. Instead, Ewan's identifier, for example, was his role as a dutiful and hard-working officer. Now, some of this characterization was no doubt a rhetorical device to try and ensure a favourable outcome. Dalby was hardly likely to bring up Ewan's shady past in his petition if he could get away with not doing so. Nonetheless, Dalby was under no obligation to employ Ewan as his bailiff, but he surely did so because Ewan was in possession of the necessary skills and talent required for that role. In light of the above analysis, it seems fair to deduce that while sanctuary seekers were hardly on the periphery of the community in and around Beverley, some were still vulnerable to being portrayed as somewhat distinct, at least when it suited the agendas of others to do so. Certainly, the Christian sentiments of Beverley's populace that even the most heinous criminal was deserving of the mercy sanctuary afforded them must have been tested by some of those admitted to the liberty, whose commitment to moral reform and redemption may not have always been exemplary. But while this is an important consideration, we should perhaps caution against pushing it too far, not least because it's an impression generated from an extraordinary incident and by individuals whose motives for discrediting the sanctuary seekers involved were likely anything but honest. But it could be the case that those like Ewan, who, like Ewan, were admitted to the sanctuary for serious offences such as murder, faced greater hurdles assimilating the community at Beverley than others did. Indeed, it's fair to assume that those admitted to the liberty for lesser felonies and debt, categories under which the majority of those recorded in the register fall, that their chances of securing a relatively assured existence thereafter was likely much greater. One Benjamin Derham, originally from London, for example, who was admitted to the liberty of St. John on 15th of April 1529 for debt, seemingly felt this was the case, for either at the time he was admitted or shortly thereafter his family had clearly relocated from London to join him. Unfortunately, we only know this because of a petition he submitted to the Chancellor sometime in the mid-1530s, when his livelihood had taken a turn for the worst. For on this occasion he complained that his wife and children had been forced to flee from Beverley to parts unknown due to threats made against them by certain men of the town. These same men had also made false claims of trespass against Derham himself, resulting in him being imprisoned on 2 separate occasions. So obviously life wasn't great for Derham and his family at the time he authored his petition. Nevertheless, it seems to have been before this date, for he described to the Chancellor how he had been carving out a relatively successful life there before he and his family had been aggrieved in the manner outlined above. He wrote that by being imprisoned his business as a craftsman had suffered. Furthermore, he lamented that his name had been slandered in the locality, which he feared would damage his ability to successfully practice his trade thereafter. Again, as with the petitions of Dalby and Laxton, Booth and Gates above, such unfortunate instances are relatively isolated examples in the historical record, which, while valuable in themselves, should not be considered representative of the experience of the vast majority who sought sanctuary at Beverley. Indeed, sanctuary men and women were not unwelcome individuals, for they lived and worked alongside the townspeople of Beverley, townspeople that one could imagine would have been able to make their voices heard should they have felt that the continued provision of sanctuary for a plethora of offenders was an affront to their notions of what constituted due justice and mercy. After all, several scholars have convincingly demonstrated that sanctuary could not operate, at least not as effectively as we witness at Beverley, without the consent of the local community in its environs. Gervase Rosser is one such academic. In 1996, he explored the impact of local communities in determining the efficacy of sanctuaries in their midst, a work which has proved hugely influential in sanctuary scholarship ever since. He argued that the potency of such loci at particular junctures remained primarily a function of the strength of feeling in the neighbourhood group. The outcome was a medieval institution of sanctuary, which, while it owed its forms to the juris of church and state, remained dependent for its operation on the local community. So this is why it's important to try and also ensure that we balance the insights generated by such extraordinary sources, like those explored above, with those that we might consider to be more ordinary and everyday. Extraordinary sources, that is, those that enter the historical record because they are atypical, are valuable in that they allow us to explore precisely what it was that deviated from the status quo. But to place too much emphasis on them would be to normalise the events and incidents that they record. Even when we read such sources against the grain, we're somewhat bound by the constraints of their extraordinary nature. Thus, we must also explore sources that tacitly record something of the lives of the sanctuary men and women within the liberty. Now, this is of course not easy, since many people in this period never entered the historical record. However, we can get a sense of the lives of some of those who were admitted to the liberty of St. John, even when their lives weren't as eventful as some of those explored above. We just have to use surviving and often overlooked source material imaginatively. Now, a valuable but ignored set of sources that can be used for the purposes outlined above are the sources for the collection of parliamentary subsidies. In this period, subsidies were not collected regularly, but were granted by Parliament at the specific request of the sovereign. And they couldn't just be granted for anything, but were intended as exceptional grants to meet the extraordinary necessities of the Crown. Typically, this was in the time of war or national crisis. Importantly, for our purposes here, the Subsidy Act stipulated that the sums were to be levied within the liberties, franchises, sanctuaries, ancient demesnes, and other whatsoever places exempt or not exempt as without, or some variation thereof. This meant that sanctuary seekers were not immune from taxation. Unfortunately, while this means that sanctuary seekers were recorded on the rolls drawn up by the commissioners appointed to collect the taxation, they were not distinguished from those non-privileged persons they were inhabiting alongside, although this is telling in itself. Nonetheless, it is sometimes possible to cross-reference the names recorded on the assessment rolls with other source material documenting the names of those admitted to particular sanctuaries. And of course, the Beverley Sanctuary Register is exceptionally useful in this regard. Now, the rate of survival for taxation records for Beverley for the period covered by the Sanctuary Register is somewhat patchy, unfortunately, and even when rolls do survive, they're sometimes in poor condition, defying transcription. Fortunately, the roll drawn up by the commissioners appointed to collect the subsidy granted to Henry VIII in 1523 for the East Riding survives almost completely intact. It is located, along with all other taxation records that were returned to the Exchequer, in the National Archives at Kew. The names of over 200 individuals taxed within the Liberty of Beverley are recorded, along with an estimate of their wealth and the amount that they were taxed as a result. So here is one of the 18 routelettes that form the parchment roll that records the names of all those taxed for the collection of the 1523 subsidy in the East Riding, and this was collected in July 1524. And this is the rotelette on which the entries for Beverley begin. So all 18 rotelettes were sewn together to form one huge roll, and in the left-hand column we've got the names of the individuals who met the minimum threshold for taxation, sometimes along with their occupation and the value of the lands and goods on which they were taxed. And in the right-hand column we've got the sum that they paid. Now, as I'm sure many of you are probably thinking, using taxation records in this manner is not without its difficulties. The entries are brief, since they were compiled with one purpose in mind, to record the payment of taxation. Thus, it's not possible to know for certain whether a name recorded on the subsidy rolls corresponds to that set down in the Sanctuary Register, because we have so little information that might allow us to corroborate their identity. In instances when we're dealing with people who have common occupational names, these problems are compounded. Nonetheless, it's still a worthy exercise, not least because it is one of the few means we have at our disposal to try and understand something of the everyday lives of those who sought sanctuary at Beverley and get some sense of how long they remained there. A handful of names recorded in the Beverley Sanctuary Register can be reliably cross-referenced with the rolls drawn up in July 1524. Might William Hayton, who was taxed 10 pence on goods worth 33 shillings 4 pence, for example, be the same William Hayton who was admitted to the Liberty of St. John just a few months earlier, on 23rd of February 1524, on account of his debts? It's quite possible. He'd travelled all the way from Carlisle, a journey of some 150 miles. Hayton was taxed more than the majority of those recorded on the roll for Beverley. Those taxed were ranked in descending order by amount paid, suggesting he'd been able to carve out and sustain a comfortable life in Beverley. Assessed alongside Hayton was one Ralph Wright, taxed 7 pence. This may well be the same Ralph Wright, barber, who was admitted to the Liberty of St. John 7 months earlier, on 1st of January. Similar to Hayton, on account of his debts. Again, we can't be certain that this is the same individual entered in the Beverley Register, but it is probable. He's the only person with that name recorded on the subsidy roll, for starters. Wright had travelled all the way from Melbourne in Cambridgeshire, some 140 miles away. He undoubtedly had his reasons for doing so. John Sutton was another individual taxed who may well have been a privileged person. An individual of the same name had been admitted to the sanctuary a year and a half earlier, on 15th of December 1522. Again, for debt. In the Sanctuary Register, he is identified as a husbandman from Dunton in Buckinghamshire, which means he travelled over 150 miles to claim the privilege. In 1524, he was taxed at 4 pence on his goods, a sum which puts him at the lower end of those assessed. The fact that Sutton was admitted a year and a half before the subsidy was collected doesn't mean that he wasn't the same person. Of course, there's a chance he wasn't, but a year and a half wasn't a long time for individuals to be in sanctuary. After all, we know that felons would often remain in sanctuary for lengthy periods, for years, and, as the case of Ewan above demonstrated, sometimes even decades. But our clearest insight into the length of time individuals might seek asylum is a list of those in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, bearing the date 1st of June 1533. This source constitutes one of only a handful of lists of sanctuary men and women to survive, as opposed to a register of admission to a particular sanctuary. It records the name of each sanctuary seeker along with their crime and the length of time that had elapsed since their admission. According to this register, the average time spent in sanctuary was 23 months. When we break this down even further, according to crime, those guilty of homicide had been in the sanctuary an average of just over 18 months, while felons had spent an average of just under 30. Many, no doubt, stayed considerably longer. But for some unknown reason, even though the resident debtors were recorded on this list, the duration of their stay was not. Nevertheless, a list of debtors in the sanctuary at Westminster in 1569 records the names of 17 individuals, some of whom were indebted to hundreds of thousands of pounds in today's money. The average time they had spent in sanctuary was approximately 3 years at the time the list was compiled. And there's no reason to suppose that those admitted to the liberty of St. John would have spent any less time in sanctuary than their privileged counterparts at Westminster. In fact, it was perhaps harder for individuals to remain in the sanctuary at Westminster for lengthy periods. Not only was the sanctuary precinct there not as extensive as at Beverley, perhaps limiting the ability of many to practice their trades, but it was also far more expensive. In 1471, the scribe William Evesham wrote to his patron Sir John Paston, of the famous family of letters, from within the sanctuary precinct there, to which he had fled on account of his debts. He complained to Paston that he remained there at great expense and among right and reasonable askers. Indeed, the 3 aforementioned sanctuary seekers identified on the assessment roll for the East Riding were clearly managing to carve out a life at Beverley. Hayton, Wright and Sutton had met the minimum threshold for taxation. They were taxed within the borough of Beverley. They had not been exiled to the peripheries of the Liberty and the sanctuary precinct as undesirable. This suggests some degree of successful assimilation within the wider municipal community. This insight helps balance out the extraordinary incidents of the lives of sanctuary seekers explored above. It wasn't all trouble and hardship for Beverley's privileged inhabitants. And there is nothing to indicate that the 3 sanctuary seekers identified here were any different than their privileged counterparts in this regard. The 3 are representative of many of those who sought sanctuary at Beverley, for example. 208 of the 493 admitted to the Liberty were also debtors. So if the surviving taxation records that cover Beverley were to be systematically studied and cross-referenced with the names on the sanctuary register, I've no doubt that similar experiences could be found that mirror the aforementioned cases, not only for debtors but for all caste of offenders. Certainly none of the sanctuary seekers I've identified on the assessment roll for 1524 were felons, but this shouldn't lead us to conclude that only debtors could carve out a life in the Liberty. While some felons would have fled to Beverley through their own volition, and thus brought goods and money with them, many would have abjured there. And as outlined above, at the time a felon abjured, as was the case with John Goodman explored earlier, all their goods were forfeit to the Crown. Thus, many likely didn't meet the minimum threshold for taxation, even though we can assume many of them were, like Griffith Ewan, able to find employment once they arrived. So while taxation records are valuable, they still have their limitations. Now, in light of the above analysis, it should come as no surprise to us to find that privileged individuals seemingly remained within the Liberty after the sanctuary rights that protected them were dissolved by Act of Parliament in 1540. One Thomas Bell was taxed on goods worth 20 shillings in 1544. Might this have been the same Thomas Bell, a London merchant, who was admitted to the Liberty in 1538 on account of his debts? Now, the surname Bell is quite common, so we can't draw the connection too sharply, but he's the only Bell recorded on the subsidy roll for 1544. And as we now know, 4 years in sanctuary was not exactly atypical. Bell's reason for staying, as we can speculate many of those who were in the sanctuary at Beverley at the date it was dissolved in 1540 did, were likely twofold. First, the majority of the individuals whose names have been considered here and in the sanctuary exhibit had successfully managed to establish themselves within the broader community inhabiting the sanctuary precinct of St. John. They lived, worked, perhaps socialised, and sometimes even fought with their non-privileged neighbours. Certainly the prosperity of several of those admitted to the Liberty wasn't always so assured, but as I said earlier, I think we can safely assume that they were in a minority. For if this was the case, we might expect to find more of the extraordinary sources in the historical record than survive. The second reason many sanctuary men and women likely stayed behind after 1540 is that they remained privileged individuals, in spite of the fact that Beverley's sanctuary rights had been dissolved. For while the Act of 1540 abolished all those private sanctuaries in England, it also declared that it was not to prejudice those who had already claimed sanctuary. In theory, this meant that a vestigial continuance of the sanctuary privileges of St. John continued after this date. Thus Bell, along with all others throughout England who had claimed sanctuary before 31st July 1540, that is, the date that the Act of 1540 received the royal assent and was enacted in law, could continue to enjoy such form of privileges as long as they liked at particular locations thereafter. It's perhaps precisely because of this reason that Thomas Bell was there as late as 1544. Indeed, this is probably a good point to end on, for while the Act of 1540 abolished all existing private sanctuary rights, it paid homage to the law of mercy. Rather than completely abolish sanctuary, the Act established 8 sanctuary towns in England, ostensibly in emulation of the 6 Old Testament cities of refuge. The sanctuary towns nominated were Wells, Westminster, York, Norwich, Northampton, Derby, Manchester and Launceston. Manchester was substituted with Chester in 1542, which would in turn be substituted with Stafford the same year. These were the only locations after 1540 at which sanctuary for term of life could be sought. Nonetheless, Beverley's history as a place of sanctuary did not entirely end in 1540. While the continuance of the vestigial sanctuary rights that were permitted to those who had claimed them before this date likely had a fairly short lifespan, the Minster Church itself, along with all churches and churchyards throughout England, could continue to shelter felons for 40 days, as they had done for centuries before this date. Indeed, sanctuary would not be abolished in England until the final Parliament of James I in 1624. And even then, it would be incorrect to say that this was because the conceptual significance of sanctuary was obsolete by this date. Quite the contrary. My PhD research has demonstrated that sanctuary's utility would be consistently recognised and reaffirmed throughout the remainder of the 16th century, and gradually appropriated into the common law in a manner that precipitated its disappearance under the first Stuart king. The conceptual underpinnings of sanctuary had not been dissolved, but had found new outlets, through the channels of royal justice than by way of royal grant for certain select locations. Refuge, asylum, sanctuary, however you refer to the provision of places through which the oppressed and needy can find safety, was not confined to barbarous periods in our history, to times which lacked complex legal systems that could sufficiently protect the innocent and punish the guilty, as many early scholars on sanctuary would have us believe. Those involved in the Beverley Sanctuary Project have done a fantastic job of illuminating how the provision of places of asylum remains as significant today as it did in medieval society, as a means of protecting those dispossessed by war or facing persecution, for example. So places of sanctuary may be less tangible to us than they were to our medieval and early modern predecessors, but the concepts this term embodies are a feature of each and every society. This is why the history of sanctuary needs to be told, because when it is, it becomes immediately apparent that the very principles that motivated the foundation and operation of such places remain as fundamental to us today as they did to our ancestors hundreds of years ago. Thank you. And obviously, unfortunately, I can't take any of your questions live today, but here is my email address, and please do ping any thoughts or, like I say, questions that you've got, and I'll be more than happy to answer them and get back to you straight away. Thank you very much.